yourself. Hit it. Yeah.
I did.
Okay, now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Happy CSW66. We are so happy to be here with the OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights from Geneva. So many of them are here in our small NGO CSW office spread around. So we are very pleased because actually it was 2 years ago when the pandemic hit and we were going to have our first collaborative event within the UN headquarters. We had a room reserved and a name list of people because we had restricted participation. Thankfully, because we're virtual, we don't have that limitation. So we're very appreciative that actually finally we get to realize this 2 years later. And I'm so excited to learn a lot today about all the various mechanisms, and I'm going to keep it short so we can have the presenters present as much as possible. So I hand it off and thank you again, everyone, for this, and nice to see you. And of course, the chat, let me explain the chat actually, it's at home. You can put in your questions, and we don't have enough time to open the mics, so you won't have a chance to say your question, but we encourage you in the chat. We're going to be monitoring that, and the experts will address it during or after when there is time. But if that's okay, please do engage. I know you're very good at engaging on chat, and we encourage that. So thank you, and I will turn it over to Lisa.
Hello, good morning. My name is Lisa Sekadra. I hope you can all hear me. I am working with OHCHR National Institutions and Regional Mechanisms section, and we're very happy and pleased to be here to co-organize this event with the NGO CSW. I'm here in New York at Church Center. And I would just like to run through the objectives just for this meeting, knowing that we planned this several years ago, but with the pandemic, we were not able to do it. This is a one-year training seminar for civil society, one-day training seminar for civil society to enhance knowledge on UN and regional mechanisms dealing with violence against women. And in general, we would like to increase collaboration of civil society with the platform of the United Nations, Regional Independent Monitoring Mechanisms on Violence Against Women. And we would like to share ideas with CSOs and women's organizations on how they could use this platform. And this platform contributes to accelerating the implementation of existing international and legal policy framework on violence against women at the global and regional and national level. And this is done by strengthening thematic cooperation, institutional links between global and UN independent monitoring mechanisms on violence against women. So we have a whole schedule today in the morning, and we will start with an overview from the Council of Europe on the GREVIO mechanism, and also have views from the GREVIO chair. And then we will proceed with a discussion on the African human rights system with a focus again on violence against women. And we will also have the Special Rapporteur for the rights of women in Africa from the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And this will then be followed by a discussion on the UN mechanisms, where we will have, again, the different UN mechanisms dealing with violence against women, including the Special Rapporteur. So without taking more time on this, I would like to invite Joanna Nels, the Executive Secretary to the Istanbul Convention, to take the floor. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and hello to the participants. Hello from Strasbourg in France, where I'm actually sitting in the same room as the GREVIO president, Iris Luarasi, which explains the name behind this this screen frame. I would like to tell you a little bit about the monitoring mechanism under the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, which is the regional legal instrument here in Europe for violence against women. And in short, it is known as the Istanbul Convention, where it opened for signature 10 years ago, almost 11 now. The aim of the monitoring mechanism established under this convention is to assess and improve the implementation of the convention by its parties, and there are 35 of them currently. So the assessment is country by country, and there are in fact two distinct bodies that interact with each other that were set up by this convention. One is the independent group of experts, which is GREVIO, and the president of GREVIO, Iris Luarasi, will shortly be taking the floor. So these are the independent experts. In addition to that, there is a political body called the Committee of the Parties, which is composed of the representatives of the state parties to the Istanbul Convention. GREVIO conducts a baseline evaluation of the implementation of the provisions of the convention country by country, and issues very specific targeted findings that really seek to enhance the implementation at national level. And these findings are taken up by the Committee of the Parties and turned into recommendations, if you like, in the areas that GREVIO has found most requiring urgent action. Both of these bodies can receive information from NGOs in support of their assessment of the situation on the ground. So for GREVIO, for example, information can be sent in at any time during the evaluation procedure, and the Istanbul Convention Secretariat, in fact, reaches out to national NGOs well in advance of an evaluation procedure. And in addition to this, GREVIO also meets with NGOs during the evaluation visits that GREVIO carries out to each country. The Committee of the Parties reviews the implementation of its own recommendations, which it issues on the basis of the findings of GREVIO. And for this review, it also welcomes information from NGOs on the specific issues that are covered in the recommendations. So NGOs from the relevant countries are invited to contribute. Now, this is a very new procedure. It's been applied once last December because that was the very first time that the Committee of the Parties has reviewed the first set of recommendations, because the 3-year implementation period for the first set of state parties had come to an end. Once the Committee of the Parties adopts recommendations, it gives the state parties 3 years to implement these and report back. So this period of 3 years has now come to an end for the first set of state parties, which allowed the Committee of the Parties to go through this review process for the very first time, inviting also NGOs to contribute to this. So as I said, a new process, but it is very well explained on the Istanbul Convention website, which in general offers explanation as to how NGOs can come into the evaluation procedure, both by GREVIO and the Committee of the Parties. So this is basically the general possibilities that the Istanbul Convention foresees in terms of the monitoring of the Istanbul Convention and supports from NGOs to the specific monitoring bodies. For the more detailed presentation on how this works in practice, I'll hand over to the GREVIO president, Iris. And since we're in the same room, I'll just get up from my chair.
Thanks, Johanna. So I'm continuing where Johanna left it. So just wanted to explain that. Just give me a second to, yeah. So just wanted to say that how it could be cooperating with GREVIO by NGOs. There are several ways, because the advancement of women's rights to be free from violence, it absolutely requires joint efforts. And we know that it requires a lot of commitment at international, European, and of course, at national level. So the Istanbul Convention provides opportunities to bring all the relevant actors together, including international organizations, national decision makers, civil society organizations, and NGOs. So the Istanbul Convention, in its Article 9, duly recognizes the importance of involving civil society bodies in all efforts to end violence against women. And it also sets out the opportunity for NGOs and national human rights institutions to contribute to the monitoring work of GREVIO that was presented by Johanna previously. So civil society can actively contribute to the monitoring process of the Istanbul Convention, and we are inviting international and national NGOs to provide valuable submission at any time, even before GREVIO decides to examine the situation in a particular country and set a deadline for state reporting. We are reaching out to relevant NGOs and civil society entities in order to encourage their contribution in the form of written submission. We also call shadow reports or participation in meetings that are being held during our evaluation visits in different state parties. And this is an important step as they are able to provide important information on the practical implementation of laws and policies. And this helps a lot the GREVIO to set thematic priorities for the evaluation visits. Another way is that NGOs are encouraged to support GREVIO in its subsequent evaluation by sharing information, commenting on data in reaction to state reports as soon as possible after their publication and before GREVIO carries out the examination of the state reports. So that's why we strongly encourage NGOs to work through coalitions, network of platforms, drawing on the experiences gained from NGO participation from other monitoring mechanisms. And this remains one of the most valuable ways of sharing NGO resources and expertise, and of organizing the necessary information flow among NGOs, and eventually contributing effectively to our work, GREVIO's work. So in addition to reporting, many NGOs and civil society organizations are spearheading independent advocacy efforts around the Istanbul Convention, campaigning to raise awareness of its objectives and lobbying for its ratification are vital in ensuring the Istanbul Convention's full implementation. So in this regard, we encourage all of you to continue your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing that contribution. Sorry, I'm getting an echo here. Okay, hope you can hear me. Thank you so much for sharing your contribution from GREVIO and how, and also in the advocacy. Any questions in the comment box yet? But I would like to open the floor. Maybe we could take a couple of questions before we move on to the next mechanism. Is there anybody? You just need to raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask. Okay, there's one question. Let's see. How can we contact GREVIO? There's one question there. Maybe you can put in the chat box the contact details of how NGOs can get in touch with you.
Yeah, that's what we are going to do.
Is there any presentation? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, now we do.
Okay, I think the main question was how could they contact GREVIO? So maybe you could include that in the chat box, your contact details, and whether you have a presentation available or notes, you could share it with the organizers, you could share it with us, and we could circulate that to the different people. And there is another question, let me see.
What is the implementation?
The other question is, what is the implementation rate under this new follow-up procedure? That question is for you, GREVIO representatives.
So I'm trying to give a response to Dubravka's question for the implementation rate. Actually, it's not a duty of GREVIO, but it's a duty of Committee of the Parties to do this implementation rate and to follow up the procedure. So we'll just do the technical part, and they are the political body and decision-making body on that. So that's why we cannot say a percentage of implementation rate, but just this December, it was a follow-up for the 4 countries that first were evaluated, and all the recommendation of state parties were approved, and they were welcomed from the 4 governments that were under the consideration.
Thank you so much.
And Louise also put it on the chat to the webpage, and also the webpage for that is dedicated to the NGO. So you have both information here on the chat.
Thank you so much. I invite you to look at the chat box for that information. There was a hand up, but I think it's gone down now.
Is there another question about the Asian from Taiwan as the Asian countries? Does the Istanbul Convention accept an Asian country?
Okay, there is another question on, does the Istanbul Convention accept any Asian country ratifications?
Yes, of course. Istanbul Convention welcomes ratification from every country in the world. Right now, it is in baby steps with Tunisia and Kazakhstan. So those are 2 countries not part of the Europe, but we have started this kind of collaboration of signing the Istanbul Convention. So if the NGOs can lobby with their respective governments in order to make them aware of the benefits of having the Istanbul Convention, that will absolutely be very welcome and appreciated from the convention and from the GREVIO Secretariat, but also GREVIO Committee.
Thank you very much for your response. I think you have clearly seen how you can collaborate, even if you're not from the region, by lobbying with your governments to ratify that convention. Are there any other questions before we move on to the next body? Somebody is saying it's important we get countries outside the EU and Europe to sign. What are the issues stopping this? Perceptions, understanding of VAW, violence against women? Would you like to respond, please?
Yeah, I think there are so many obstacles sometimes, and perception is one of them. And there is also a lot of backlash about the Istanbul Convention and trying to spread fake news about the convention. And so all of that contribute to other countries understanding the convention, but also understanding the concept of violence against women as a whole. So that's why we always have partnership with the NGOs, and we find them as a great ally on the work, because it's up to them to make people aware, but also the government aware for the benefits of the convention and in order to convince the respective parliaments to sign and also to ratify the convention. Because at the end of the day, the benefits all goes for women's rights and especially for women victims in this case. So that's why I think it's an obligation for every NGO in the world, not only for the NGOs that are located in Council of Europe countries to make a lot of lobby and advocacy efforts in order to bring up this discussion of Istanbul Convention and signature and ratification of it.
Thank you very much for that response. I think it was very clear. There is one, let's take one last question from the floor. It says, is GREVIO engagement limited to NGOs? Would research-oriented projects hosted at research institutes or universities qualify? One would think that evidence-based approaches would be valued in GREVIO programs monitoring efforts. Please take that question.
Yep, because I muted myself. Yeah, I said it from the beginning that yeah, everybody can contribute. So it's not limited only to the NGOs because Istanbul Convention provides opportunities for all relevant actors. So that includes research organizations, civil society organizations, NGOs, national decision makers, and of course, even international organizations. So yeah, the response is yes, everybody can contribute to that.
Thank you so much, all the representatives from GREVIO. And there was a very interesting discussion here of how NGOs can be involved. We encourage all the NGOs on this forum to collaborate with GREVIO, to advocate with your governments to ratify the convention, and to also provide information when it's required for the various countries. So thank you very much. We will now move to the African human rights system. And we are going to look at the overview of the African human rights system with a focus on violence and discrimination against women. We shall hear from Ashwani, who is a program manager at the Human Rights and Democratization Program in the University of Pretoria. But we shall also hear from the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa from the African Human Rights Commission, who will give us details of how the mechanisms work and also potential for the collaboration with civil society and the African human rights mechanisms.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Good day, everyone. As Lisa mentioned, my name is Ashwani, and I currently work at the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. We interact a lot with the African human rights system, both as an NGO, but we also support the mechanism at the level of the African Commission, especially the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa. So since we have very little time, I'll just go into the structure. I'll first talk about what is the African human rights system. I'll then discuss the treaties on violence against women and discrimination against women. I'll also discuss a little bit the soft laws on violence against women and discrimination against women. And then Commissioner Janet will speak a little bit about the role of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa in combating violence against women and discrimination. And after her intervention, I'll elaborate a little bit on how CSOs can engage with the African human rights system. So the African human rights system came into being with the adoption of the African Charter in 1981. So since the 1950s, we've had the Organization of African Unity, whose main objective was democratization throughout Africa and independence from the colonials. But then as time went by, we realized with apartheid in South Africa and other human rights violations that are happening, that the objective cannot just be decolonization, but there has to be other objectives. So then in 2001, the Constitutive Act of the African Union was adopted, and it had a human rights aspect to it. But even before that, we had the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which I'll discuss a little bit in the next slide. So we also have sub-regional human rights system. For instance, at the West African level, we have the Economic Community of Western African States. At the Eastern level, we have the East African Community, and then we also have the Southern African Development Community. Both the ECOWAS and the EAC have a tribunal that have a human rights mandate, and the ECOWAS the Community Court of Justice has actually been very proactive and has used laws that have been adopted by the African Union to have decisions concerning discrimination against women. So the African Charter and the African human rights system was inspired by an African conception of human rights. So if you look at the African Charter, it's very different from the international, sorry, this is what happens when you're many sitting in a room. So the African level is very different from the international level, where you have the ICCPR and the ICSCR that provides for civil and political rights and economic, social, cultural rights differently. At the African human rights system level, the African Charter included both civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights, and even group rights. So as much as the African Charter established the African human rights system, in the current days, we have a variety of human rights instruments. I'll focus on those that speak on violence against women and discrimination against women. So firstly, the African Charter in Article 2 speaks on non-discrimination on the basis of sex. So obviously all the rights in the African Charter are applicable to women. And then there's Article 18.3 that also speaks on the protection of women from discrimination as per international standards. So it includes the CEDAW in Article 18.3. And then there's a case that was decided in 2011 against Egypt. It's called Inter-Rights versus Egypt. And in that case, there were journalists who were groped by protesters, and the African Commission used the CEDAW to decide that there was violence against women and discrimination against women. So at the African Union level, we can still use treaties that have been ratified by the state, including the CEDAW, when coming to a decision. So as was mentioned earlier, Tunisia is in the process of ratifying the Istanbul Convention, for instance. So the African Commission can then make a pronouncement under the Istanbul Convention. We also have the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. So this applies to anyone under the age of 18, and it does protect the girl child from violence and discrimination. One groundbreaking and very progressive document that we talk about all the time is the Protocol to the African Charter on the Rights of Women in Africa, which is also known as the Maputo Protocol. So this document is geared towards the protection of African women from discrimination and violence against women. There are several articles that is related to violence against women, and all of its article speaks to discrimination against women. But its Article 4 is very relevant for the protection of women against violence, because it has different steps that states can take to protect women from violence. And one thing that I find very interesting in the Maputo Protocol is that it is the first document that imposes a budgetary allocation obligation on states. So it mentions that states have to allocate the necessary budget to combat violence against women. We have two other protocols that have been adopted but not yet entered into force. One is on the rights of persons with disabilities, and the other one is on the rights of older persons in Africa. And they both have an aspect of protection of women, for instance, older women and women with disabilities from violence and discrimination. But at the moment, it is still not yet enforced because it doesn't have 15 ratifications. Countries are ratifying it more and more. For instance, Kenya ratified it, both treaties recently. So we foresee that in the next 2-3 years, these treaties will be enforced, and they will provide a more solid foundation for the protection of women, especially intersectional women with intersectional vulnerabilities from violence. So unlike the inter-American system or the European system, we don't have a treaty on violence against women and girls. But there, since 2,002-3 years ago, there have been talks about a draft treaty on violence against women and girls. And at the moment, we do have a draft, but it is still with the Gender Directorate of the African Union, and there's still negotiation processes going on. And I don't think it will be adopted anytime like in the next year or two. There's still a bit of discussions. It started first with violence against women, and now we've included girls. But then if you look at, was it the like it doesn't have a very big focus on domestic violence and things like that. So I think there's still scope for it to be elaborated a bit further, but it's still not applicable until it's adopted and it enters into force. So in addition to these treaties, the African Commission has also adopted soft laws on violence against women and discrimination. So these soft laws guide states in the implementation of their obligations under the different treaties that we have discussed before. So first we have general comments under Article 14(1)(d) and E of the Maputo Protocol. So this is basically on the right of women to be informed of the HIV status of their partner. And then the second one is basically on sexual and reproductive health rights. There's a variety of sexual and reproductive health rights in Article 14 of the Maputo Protocol, but one of them is also on the right to safe termination of pregnancy in certain circumstances. So it indicates how states can put in place mechanisms for women to have access to safe termination of pregnancies and that they are not discriminated against. Recently, I think it was last year, beginning of last year, no, end of 2020, the African Commission adopted an article on Article 7(d) of the Maputo Protocol, which speaks of women's property rights in case of divorce, annulment, and separation. And that's very important because it shows that the African Commission is giving importance to economic violence against women. So if you look at the Maputo Protocol, it defines violence against women as including physical, psychological, economic violence. So this particular general comment can be used to make sure that women are not subjected to economic violence when they are in instances of divorce, separation, and annulment. And then in 2017, which was the first time that two mechanisms, so we have three human rights bodies at the African Union level. We have the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is responsible for the African Commission and all other treaties. We have the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, which is responsible for the implementation of the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. And then we have the African Court on Human and People's Rights. The African Children's Committee and the African Commission are quasi-judicial bodies, whereas the African Court is a judicial and human rights body. So two of the quasi-judicial bodies, the African Commission and the African Children's Committee, came together and adopted a general comment on ending child marriages. After that, the African Commission also adopted guidelines on combating sexual violence and its consequences in Africa. That was in 2017. So this is a very important guideline because if states do follow it, it can lead to concrete results in how they are dealing with sexual violence and its consequences. And recently, in the context of COVID, the African Commission or the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa have adopted several press releases and statements for the protection of women during COVID-19. Before going into the different ways that CSOs can engage with the African human rights mechanisms, I'll hand over to Commissioner Janet for her to elaborate a little bit on the role of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa in combating violence against women and discrimination against women. Commissioner Janet.
Okay, thank you very much, Ashwane. You said a lot about the Commission, and I want to greet everybody that is on this platform and to say that I feel honored to be taking part in this very important platform. I bring you greetings. I'm Gambian. I'm the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women and work in the Gambia, but unfortunately, the Commission has hosted. But this platform is so important to me as I had to take time off. You can see I'm in a very difficult environment right now, sitting out amongst the trees. Very nice environment, but also very difficult. You might even be hearing background noise. So I won't take too much time because I can see that she said a lot of things which really speak to, she rightly observed, is the umbrella body established under the African Charter, tasked with the responsibility of the promotion and the protection of human rights in Africa. And in a bid to promote and protect the rights of women in Africa, the Commission itself established a special mechanism of a Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women. At this juncture, I just want to turn off the video because my internet is very unstable here. If I don't turn it off, then you might not be able to hear me. So bear with me. I just turn on the video and I'll continue at this point.
Thank you, Commissioner. That's fine.
So as I indicated, the commission established the special mechanism of special rapporteur. And this mechanism is one of the oldest of the African Commission. Its establishment, as rightly observed by Ashwane, is the Commission's firm determination to promote the rights of women and girls and to combat discrimination and injustice that they continue to face within the continent, including violence against women and girls. Since its inception, I think Ashwani has mentioned a lot of initiatives embarked upon by the Commission, the soft laws, the general comments, the guidelines, and these are all pioneered by the mechanism. They're actually implemented through the special mechanism, supported by the Pretoria Center and so many other partners that we work with. So as GREVIO was making the presentation, bringing out the relevance of civil society, I wouldn't go into that, but just to reinforce the fact that the work we do as a special rapporteur is to implement the activities of the Commission relevant to the rights of women in Africa. So every initiative that has been highlighted here has been implemented, like I rightly observed, through the special mechanism of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women. I think there have been so many achievements by the mechanism supported by partners. I will repeat because we have to acknowledge the partners that we work with, and the Pretoria Center is one such valuable partner. But one of the most remarkable achievements of the Special Rapporteur mechanism was the adoption of the Maputo Protocol, because the pioneer chair, the pioneer Special Rapporteur was really instrumental in working with partners. And when I say partners, I mean civil society, research institution, women's rights organization, state parties, to actually work very hard towards the adoption of the Maputo Protocol, which has been adopted and has been actually applauded as one of the most progressive women's rights instruments the world all over, because CEDAW is very important, but the African protocol is actually specific and unique, and the rights embodied in the protocol are broader and more specific and unique to the African continent. So this was an initiative that the Commission, through the mechanism of the Special Rapporteur, embarked upon. Apart from that, also, the Special Rapporteur also, apart from just promoting and ensuring that the protocol was adopted, has one of its main responsibilities is to advocate for the ratification of the protocol. Not only ratify, but also implementation and enforcement. So the mechanism actually embarks on missions on member states. And during those missions, we reinforce the fact that states should not only ratify, but they should adopt laws, policies, and plans to ensure the implementation of the protocol. Otherwise, all the gains we have made in terms of adopting the protocol will go to naught if they're not implemented, if the protocol is not ratified. So this is something that the mechanism actually spends a lot of time doing in terms of addressing women's rights, dealing with issues of violence against women, and prohibition of discrimination against women. Another mechanism that the Special Rapporteur actually embarks on is the issue of resolutions. Through our cooperation with our partners, again, it could be NGOs, it could be research institutions. When certain specific issues arise related to violence against women, the mechanism will actually issue resolutions to condemn, to denounce, and to make recommendations to state parties as to what they should do with regard to matters relating to violence against women. So these are some of the things, and several recommendations, resolutions have been issued relating to violence against women, problems with women in armed conflict, generally all over Africa. In fact, the recent one was the last one we issued during the 6th session of the African Commission, because the feedback came from our partners and the NGOs, and the realization dawned on us that the problems, the incidents of women being used as spoils of war, the problems that women encounter, violence against women within armed conflict, been so rife and so prevalent that we thought it fit to issue a resolution on that. So in short, everything that has been highlighted about what the Commission does, it does through its special mechanism. And I think another thing that we do apart from resolution is urgent letters of appeal. Because if a situation arises where there's rampant and very grave human rights violation, including violence against women, we will actually issue letters of appeal to state parties, to appeal to them to remedy wrongs, and also make sure that we also issue letters of concern. But one thing I will that we always do, and I will all civil society organizations, NGOs, to actually be very proactive about, is the issue of our complaints mechanism. Because our complaints mechanism is the mechanism through which the rights of women are litigated. So civil society organizations have a pivotal role to play, because you find that the women whose rights are violated invariably will not have the resources and the means to approach the commissions. So they come and approach the commissions through civil society. So this is a mechanism in which I'm sure Shawani will go into detail on that. But another role that the Special Rapporteur mechanism actually carries out proactively is through the state reporting mechanism. When states submit their reports, we make sure that we call them to task. They need to report on women's rights issues. They need to report on women's rights violations. They need to report on laws, rules, regulations, and plans they have in fulfillment of the Maputo Protocol. And in that respect, specific questions are asked. States are called to task. They're asked to report on it. And if they fail to do so, specific recommendations are made to ensure that they comply. So in short, these are some of the mechanisms that the Special Rapporteur embarks on to ensure the rights of women are upheld, they're protected, and that women's matters of violence against women are addressed. Basically, in short, this is what we do. And I think you can continue to supplement the information I have provided. Sorry, I'm speaking in a rush because I need to get back to my session. Yes.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for elaborating a little bit on the role of the Special Rapporteur of the Rights of Women in Africa. Commissioner mentioned that it is one of the oldest mechanisms established by the African Commission, and to just mention that it was established in 1999. So the mechanism was very pivotal in the drafting and adoption of the Maputo Protocol, which is now like the major document that we use for the protection of women against violence and from discrimination. So there was a question just before the Special Rapporteur spoke about the difference between a treaty and a protocol. So the main difference is that a treaty is a standalone document. So for instance, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights is a standalone document, whereas the protocol to the African Charter on the Rights of Women in Africa is attached to the African Charter. So you could not have had the protocol without attaching it to the African Charter. But one question that I've always asked is, why did we not have a standalone document for the rights of women at the African Union level, similar to the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child? So for children's rights, we have a separate treaty that's not linked at all to the African Charter that creates its own monitoring mechanism, such as the African Committee on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, whereas for women's rights, we adopted it as a supplement. So according to Article 66 of the African Charter, you can actually adopt documents to supplement the provisions of the African Charter. So they realized that Article 2 and Article 18.3 was not enough, so they went on and adopted a protocol to supplement the provisions. But this is an argument that I always have. Why did we not just have another treaty that would stand alone, that would create its own mechanism, its own overseeing body? Because similar to all treaties, implementation is a very big problem. The African Commission, as you can see, is a body of 11 commissioners, and then they have to look at all the treaties that's already there. So although we have the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa, it's only one person. Commissioner Janet cannot do everything. She cannot focus really every day, all day on women's rights when she has to also implement her other duties as per a commissioner of the African Commission. So maybe a standalone treaty would have been better. So which is why the Treaty on Violence Against Women that we are discussing at the moment is a standalone treaty. It's not a protocol to any of the charter that we have already. Now, coming back to engaging with the African human rights system as civil society organizations. So the main way through which you can interact is by having observer status. If you don't have observer status, it might be a bit difficult for you as a CSO to engage with the African human rights system unless it's in the form of litigation. So you can, if you don't have observer status, you can apply for observer status. And as you say here, it doesn't say that you need to be an African NGO. You just need to be an NGO working in the field of human rights in Africa. And the benefits of that is that you can participate in public sessions, you can have access to non-confidential documents, but you need to give enough time for the African Commission to prepare the documents. But also, if it's really confidential documents, you might not have access to it. You get invited to private sessions, and you can address the African Commission during a session, and you can submit agenda proposals. Now, once you have observer status, you can engage in the following ways. So as I mentioned, you can make statements. The second one is norm development. Remember, I was talking about all the soft laws that the African Commission adopted. All of them were in collaboration with civil society organizations. For instance, for the general comment on child marriage, I was working with the Women's Rights Unit of the center there, and we drafted the first draft with the Special Rapporteur. We convened meetings because the African Commission also lacks funding sometimes. So we convened meetings, we had expert meeting to discuss, we had inputs from different civil society organizations. So once you have observer status, you can also engage with the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women to develop further norms on violence against women and protection of women from discrimination. And you can work with the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa. So what you can do is you can do research together with the mechanism, you can do studies, you can do reports, you can do investigations if there is a need from the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa, you can develop soft laws and so on. But one major way in which you can contribute is through state reporting. So the state reporting procedure is such that at the African Union level, once a state has ratified the African Charter or the Maputo Protocol, every second year, so it's very different from the CEDAW, which is even a longer period of time. But here, every second year, you need to present a report to the African Commission on how the state needs to present a report, on how they're implementing the obligations under the African Charter or under the Maputo Protocol. When the state presents its report, you can then, as civil society organization, prepare a shadow report. So the shadow report doesn't have to be too long. It can be just like, for instance, let's say we're talking about violence against women in South Africa, and South Africa has presented its report. What you can just say that even if South Africa has laws on protecting persons, LGBTIQ plus persons, corrective rape is still a problem. So then you provide a question that the African Commission can ask the state and recommendations that the African Commission can give the states. The other way is through litigation. I will go into locus standi, who can present a case. So here I've listed all three. Human rights bodies. For the African Commission, it's any person. So even NGOs without observer status can present a case for litigation. For the African Court, it's a bit challenging because the state needs to make a declaration under Article 34.6 of the African Court Protocol to allow individual and NGOs direct access. And many states have not yet made that declaration. And then in terms of admissibility, one important thing is that you need to exhaust local remedies. That's the primary thing. You need to have used your local courts, your local mechanisms before you're submitting it to the African Commission or the African Court or the African Children's Committee. So this was just a brief overview on how you can engage. I will be open for questions if you have any, and I see there are a few here. So I am, okay, I will go from Jade. Specific sense. And Jade mentions that it is a concern about having a standalone treaty. I think this is why we are now discussing a treaty on violence against women and girls. So the conversation about global treaty to end violence against women and girls has been ongoing. I think when Professor Rashida Manju was the Special Rapporteur, there was a lot of momentum around it, but I think at the moment, the momentum has died down a little bit, but it's never too late to start the momentum again. So Elizabeth asked how many states present their reports every 2 years. Very few, Elizabeth, very few. I think I really don't understand why they gave only 2 years for states to present their reports. And it's also very high requirements if you look at it. I think they need to simplify it. I think what they're doing at the Human Rights Committee level is very interesting, because the Human Rights Committee will just ask questions about a particular aspect and then the state will respond. I think that might work out better. And also it's a resource problem. African states are poor generally. And now you're just telling them to focus on, for instance, implement a report on the implementation of the Maputo Protocol. It's a bit challenging. So we have been training states to present their state report. But you even notice that even if you have the resources, even if you put a technical assistant to help them prepare the report, they don't prepare the report on time. There's also a lot of politics going on about who's responsible for the Maputo Protocol, who's responsible for the African Charter. I think there's a need to sit and reconfigure this 2-year of state report. So Federica, you're asking me about the status of litigation before the African Commission on Violence and Discrimination Against Women. So the only case that I know of that speaks about violence against women and discrimination against women. So there have been many cases that have been submitted to the African Commission, yeah. But then cases that have been decided, the first one is the Egyptian case that I mentioned, where they used Article 18.3 of the Maputo Protocol of the African Charter, and they mentioned the CEDAW to decide that Egypt had violated its obligations under CEDAW and has not protected women from violence and discrimination. There is an Ethiopian case where a girl was abducted and then she was forced to get married, but there was no mention of violence against women or discrimination against women. So they did not look at it from a violence against women and discrimination against women perspective. They rather looked at it from the perspective of the right to fair trial, because this girl had gone to the police, she had tried to lodge a case, but the police did not listen to her. So this was a good opportunity for the African Commission to say that this is violence against women, but they did not do that. And then at the African court level, we have a case on the Maputo Protocol against Senegal. It's Association pour le Progrès et la Défense des Femmes versus Mali. So there Mali was adopting its family code, and it still allowed for discriminatory practices against women, which was first child marriage, and then there was also like in terms of inheritance and in divorce. So then the African Commission decided that since Mali has ratified the Maputo Protocol, it has to make sure that its family code is in line with its Maputo Protocol. This decision was very groundbreaking, since it was the first time a particular regional mechanism. We had the ECOWAS before. The ECOWAS has made a lot of decisions on the Maputo Protocol, but this was the first time an African human rights mechanism mentioned the Maputo Protocol and found violations of the Maputo Protocol. So it showed that if you have forced ratifiers, if you have people who are just signing for the sake of signing, it's not going to work out. If you're signing, you need to implement. But then the problem is with implementation of the decisions, and that's a problem, I think, with all regional human rights mechanisms. Someone asked me to talk a little bit more on slide 9, so I'll go back there. So yes, so there are different ways to submit a complaint. So there's even format of how a complaint can be. So if you go, I will just copy paste it on the chat after this session. So if you go on the website of the African Commission, you will find the format of how a complaint should be. And that complaint can be lodged by email, registered mail, or physically, but many people just submit it via mail now. You will see I have written rules of procedure here. So rules of procedure are how the African Commission functions. So you will see there how the cases should be and everything, and how it should be submitted. Lack of courage, who pretend to represent women.
Commissioner Janet has the hands up.
Commissioner Janet?
Has her hands up.
Okay, yes, Commissioner Janet.
Ashwani, I just want to speak on the issue of cases on violence against women. Yes, you're right. Those are the 2 cases you know about. But I think what is important is the fact that, you know, when you file a communication before the commission. You have to be very specific on what you are claiming. You cannot expect the commission to descend into the arena and make it a pronouncement. What I would enjoy, or civil society organization,
Commissioner, I'm really sorry, but we're struggling to hear you,
what
Commissioner.
they want the commission to do for them. So if you want to have a declaration, if it just, okay, I'll just type it out on the chat. I'll type it out in the chat.
Oh, but we can hear you now, Commissioner, so you can just
You can
repeat
hear me now,
yourself.
yes.
Yes.
But I just wanted to contribute on the issue of cases on violence against women. I think it is important that cases are actually filed before the commission exclusively on matters relating to violence against women. And there's a specific relief being requested. The release must be very specific because the commission cannot descend into the arena and make a case for people. So if you make a case and it relates to something as you don't actually bring out the issue that it's a violation of women's rights, it's a matter of violence against women, then the commission will find it very difficult to make a pronouncement or declaration on that. So mine is to just urge that people who file complaints on behalf of victims are very specific as to what they want and what they want from the commission, so that the commission will now have the opportunity to really deliberate at length on those issues. Because, you know, as a COSA judicial body, it will be very tricky if we start delving into areas that were not requested for, release that are not claimed for. So this is what I would just like to urge, as this is a training, so that we actually make it very clear that they need to be very specific. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. This is actually one of the problems that has been identified, litigating on violence against women, and what exactly do you want? So many cases are brought in, and you will find they talk about procedure at the local level, the Ethiopian cases, for instance. But if they had mentioned there has been a violation of the Maputo Protocol or there has been discrimination against women. And as you said, the African Commission cannot on its own make a pronouncement if civil society organizations do not ask for such a relief. So I think it's important for civil society organizations to bring cases to the African Commission and to request the African Commission to find a violation of the rights of women, because there is violence against women and discrimination against women. Fatou, I'm really sorry about your experience, but it shows that as women, we are very resilient, and which is why you're here with us today and sharing your story and hearing about what is happening. We wish you really all the best with all your endeavors, and please keep staying strong. Thank you very much. I unfortunately do not have a French version, but I will of the presentation, but we can discuss and see how we can make it more accessible for people with different backgrounds. Yes, thank you very much. I think my time is up. Lisa is looking at me here. I thank all of you for listening to us. If you have any question, please, I will also write my email address here. I will write I will send the format of the complaint here. So if you have any question, please reach out. And all the best with the good work that you're all doing.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Janet, and thank you so much, Ashwani. We have learned so much about the African mechanisms. We have seen how civil society can access them, bringing up cases especially, and also more importantly, how the Commission is encouraging states to adopt laws and implement the protocol. So we thank you so much for this. And as you know, the discussion continues, you can still pop in questions, but we are going to move now to the UN human rights mechanisms that seek to promote and protect women's rights, violence against women. And this will be done by three different presenters. We are also going to hear from the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. We are going to hear from Melissa, the member of the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women. Sorry about that. And the CEDAW chair. So I will now share my screen because I am going to just go quickly through the general human rights mechanisms, and then we shall get very specific. So I'm not audible. Can you hear me? Am I on mute?
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay, let me put the mic closer to me. Right. Can you hear me better?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to start this presentation. Can you see the presentation? How do I get rid of these pictures on my screen? Okay, so yes, I'll go through the human rights system and so I would just like to mention that the UN human rights system is based on two regimes, the UN treaty based system and the UN charter based bodies. So within the treaty-based system, we've got 10 human rights treaties that are tasked to implement international human rights treaties. And each treaty body has an independent committee. We also have OHCHR as a secretariat for the human rights treaties. Then we have the UN charter-based bodies, which mechanism, the complaint procedure of the Human Rights Council and the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council. These are intergovernmental bodies of the Human Rights Council. And so moving on, if we look specifically at the treaty body system, we have about 9 human rights treaties that are monitored by specific treaty bodies that are called committees. So we have, for instance, if we go right to the most relevant one for this meeting, the CEDAW, which is in the middle, we have the CEDAW, the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women that was ratified in the 70s. And it has its corresponding committee, which is the CEDAW committee in the small box there that monitors the treaties. So all these treaties are thematic. And as you know, there is the CEDAW that deals with women's rights. And then, for instance, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that deals with disability, then migrant workers, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the CAT, the ICCPR that deals with civil and political rights, and the ICERD that deals with racial discrimination. So I won't go much into detail, but we know that treaty bodies have also optional protocols. So each as well, which can be procedural or thematic. So when we look at the optional protocols of UN treaties, there are some that are procedural. For example, the optional protocol to the CEDAW, which has a communications procedure. That means it can receive complaints. And then we have those that are substantive that deal with specific issues. For example, the optional protocol to the CRC on the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. So that is a thematic area which requires that states report on this. All states that have ratified this optional protocol report on issues related to the sale of children, for example, prostitution and trafficking. Whereas the communications procedure enables states that have ratified this convention to have victims approach the treaty bodies with complaints. So the mandate of the treaty bodies, we know, is to monitor compliance with treaty obligations through consideration of periodic reports. So states are obliged, as soon as they ratify, to provide reports, and the treaty bodies adopt concluding observations that provide the observations of how the state can further improve the rights of victims. And then, of course, there are the follow-up procedures. And then many treaties have inquiry procedures, so they look into patterns of human rights violations, the Convention Against Torture and the CEDAW being one of them. And of course, the communication procedure that we talked about, and I will speak more of the CEDAW one in a few details, that allows complaints to be brought to the UN. So the treaty bodies deal with the normative interpretation or clarification of treaty provisions, and they do this also by issuing general comments. So they do have general days of discussion where they will go deeper into a certain provision of a treaty and produce a general comment so that states, NGOs, and other people can use this to have interpretive clarity of a treaty provision. So the CEDAW, for example, has a general comment on trafficking, and they also have a general comment on Indigenous women. So they did have a general discussion. They call on NGOs to provide information on how this can be interpreted. And I know a lot of NGOs have been involved in the past in structuring general comments. So the reporting cycle, I think you all know, how do NGOs get involved when a state is up for review? So let's use the treaty body of CEDAW, for example. The first box is the preparation of the report. So at the really local national level, NGOs can submit information, can participate in the preparation of the report at the national level, provide information, statistics to the government, but they can also submit their own alternative reports to treaty bodies. And then during the preparation for review, there's usually a list of questions or a list of issues that are asked to the state party. NGOs can also provide information to the treaty bodies on what sort of questions to ask the state party. And of course, in this respect, with regards to women's rights, violence against women, they can send in specific questions. And then the report is considered at the United Nations by the treaty body, and concluding observations are released. And so when these observations are released, of course, NGOs can also follow up at the national level and make sure there's implementation, create dialogues, and assist in implementing the recommendations from the various treaty bodies. NGOs can also come to Geneva. Now I think everything is also virtual, and participate in sessions. Treaty bodies always have a session, or they have an opportunity for NGOs to speak and speak about, yes, and give information that is necessary for the implementation of the treaty. So if we look at the option protocol on the CEDAW, and my computer is shaky. So the optional protocol, which are also party to the CEDAW Convention, and this protocol enables individual communications to be brought by individuals, subject, of course, to an admissibility criteria, which you can look up, and therefore for NGOs to engage with, help victims, read up, of course, look at the treaty and look at the optional protocol provisions and how that is done. And then also the optional protocol, the CEDAW, enables the CEDAW committee to conduct inquiries into alleged grave or systematic violations of women's rights based on information. So as of the 31st of January 2020, 155 communications had been received by the committee, and these involved violations of the various provisions of the treaty: domestic violence, sexual violence, armed conflict, judicial gender stereotyping, trafficking, and so on and so forth. So let's move to the Human Rights Council quickly. I'm not going into the details, but it was established in 2006, and there are 57 member states. This is a very important body that sits in Geneva about 3 times a year, promoting universal respect and protection of human rights. It addresses situations and violations of human rights, including gross systematic violations. There have been discussions on Ukraine in the past, Sudan, Ethiopia, and so many issues. So this is a very important forum as well. And they contribute towards preventing human rights violations. And this is a member state intergovernmental mechanism that enables states to discuss the human rights situation of countries. So how can CSOs be involved? Of course, you can participate in Geneva, you have separate seating. You can contribute to thematic reports of OHCHR or on agenda items of the Human Rights Council. A lot of times women's rights, violence against women is discussed in the council. So NGOs can contribute, make oral statements, but also more importantly, hold parallel events during the council sessions. And there are procedures for this. You can highlight specific issues on violence against women during the council events. So this is the stage for reporting of a state party to the, we will now go into the UPR process, the Universal Periodic Review. So again, state parties are required to report to the UN every 4 years, 4 to 5 years, on the situation in their country. This is different from the treaty body process because this is an intergovernmental process and it embodies all human rights. So I will not go into the various details. It's similar to the treaty bodies, but it's done by the working group of the Human Rights Council. But up there you will see an email that is used for receiving submissions from all stakeholders, including NGOs. So it goes through a process, and of course, during the different parts of the process, NGOs may also interact with the Human Rights Council, give information, take the floor. But most importantly, it's also important to implement recommendations. So as I said, you can contribute to the stakeholders report, and here OHCHR as a secretariat reviews information provided, but NGOs can send in information. You can make general comments, you can disseminate the UPR outcome document, and you can always have issues related to violence against women. And at the national level, of course, there are various activities that you can do. So I've put in several links where you can find documentation about what I've spoken about. And I'm sorry that I was very quick. There's a lot to go through. This is a presentation that can take weeks, but I wanted to give you the highlights of the different areas that you could look into. And these are the links. I will stop sharing my screen and I will hand over to my colleague Federica, who will go into the details of, she will go into the special procedures. She will talk about the special procedure mechanisms because I have not talked about this in this presentation. Thank you, Lisa. Can you hear?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So we are basically, I'll give you very few slides on another set of human rights mechanisms. It's a set that is linked to the Human Rights Council that Lisa just mentioned. And it is called, the general name we use for that, for those mechanisms, special procedures of the Human Rights Council. And these are independent experts that are given a mandate by the UN Human Rights Council to deal, either to look into the human rights situation of a specific country or to look into thematic issues at the global level. The generic name is special procedures, but you will see that basically they can be called special rapporteur, and the most relevant here, special rapporteur on violence against women, and they can be called independent expert. They can also be working group when it's not just one individual expert, but 5 experts working together collegially. They receive this mandate by the Human Rights Council. They are appointed for 3 years that can be renewed for another 6 years. After 6 years, they cannot be renewed anymore. And these are individuals that are appointed for their own expertise and competence in relation to the thematic issue or the country, and they are not paid by the UN for doing this job. So they are doing this pro bono. They have this mandate. They can the expenses refunded, but they keep doing their own job in their places of residence, and they do this on top. They have this mandate and they do this on top of that, and they do it in their personal capacity. You know, they are, as I said, they are not paid by UN, so they're not UN staff. They are not affiliated with government, not affiliated with civil society organization, because one of the key characteristics of this mechanism is actually their independence. As of today, we have 45 thematic mandates, so quite a lot that covers a wide range of thematic issues, you name it, and there's probably one special rapporteur that can look into the issue, and 13 country mandates. The mandate, as I said, is given by the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council adopts a resolution that establishes this mandate, and that resolution also gives the parameter of the mandate, so of what the independent expert can and cannot do. Another important document that guides the work of these experts is what is called the Code of Conduct that was adopted by the UN Human Rights Council, and these are basically a set of ethical principles that the expert, when they are appointed for this job, this UN mandate, they have to abide by. But what concretely, what can they do? So basically, they can conduct country visits. They can do, and they do thematic reports to the UN Human Rights Council and to the UN General Assemblies. They are mandated. So there is a lot of, obviously the thematic mandates, they do a lot of thematic research in different ways. They also receive information on alleged human rights violations. We can look into more details, but they are not a quasi-judicial mechanism like the treaty body, like the African Commission, for example. We heard about that, but they can still receive complaints and information on alleged human rights violation that they will take up with the government concerns with an exchange of letters. And then obviously they do a lot of awareness raising in the form of media engagement. So they issue press releases, media statements, etc., and other awareness raising activities. A lot of it has to do with participation in seminars, in webinars, in workshops, and other events. If I can just maybe move on to the country visits, I think that's for the civil society is good to bear in mind, because the country visits are quite a unique opportunity for one country. First of all, they can take place only upon the invitation of the government. So if there's no invitation, there's no official country visit. Some governments have extended what we call standing invitation. So basically they say that their doors are open to special rapporteur visiting. And so the special rapporteur do not have to request an invitation, but they can move on and just say, I would like to visit in those days. Country visits are very important because they create a momentum around the human rights issue. They can also bring visibility to a thematic area that was not maybe so visible in the countries. The country also can benefit from the expertise of the mandate holders, because this expert, as you remember, they have a global mandate, so they visit different countries, different regions, and then they share good practices and observations that they have found around the world. And then the other important thing is that there is an official report on the country visit that is presented to the Human Rights Council. So there is an international debate about that particular country and that particular thematic issue. So these are the advantages of country visit. And by responding to question, we can go into more details. Just one slide on communications, which is the next slide. Thanks, Evan. As I said, we call it, that's again the generic term, communications, right? Okay. But what we mean by communication, as I mentioned, is the exchange of letters that happens between the independent expert and the government concerned when the experts receive information on alleged human rights violations in a particular country. The independent expert will examine the information, will corroborate, will verify what he receives, and then if deems warrant an action, he or she will write to the government about this. This exchange of letter can normally happens, these letters are addressed to governments as duty bearers, right? But it happens quite also frequently that letters are addressed to international organizations and also to non-state actors, including businesses. Who can submit this information? Anyone really, it's open-ended, anyone, victims, someone on behalf of their victims, their representatives, civil societies like your organizations. And do not worry, because one of the very important thing of special procedures is that they never disclose their sources. So we store information on sources very safely in our database, but we never disclose sources to the government or to the other addresses of the letters. And the communication can relate to an individual, alleged human rights violation of an individual, alleged human rights violation of a group, communities. It can also relate this exchange of letter to policies and legislation that are not deemed in compliance with international human rights norms and standards. So they can cover quite a wide range of situations. The communications, Ashwani, if you can move, thanks. The communication is a confidential procedure initially. So meaning when this exchange of letter for a period of generally of 60 days will remain confidential. So it will be between the expert and the government or the business or the international organization. Then after the 60 days period, then the letter that the exchange, or at least the letter sent by the expert and the reply of the government, if there is one, will be published on that link that I put on the slide, which is a sort of a macro site, is a platform where you can look up all the communication that were sent to your country and any reply that may have been received by which rapporteurs, on what topics, etc. The only exception to this 60-day period or confidentiality period is that the letters that I mentioned to you are about legislation and policies. They are only confidential for 2 working days, because normally they do not relate to individuals, so there aren't protection concerns around there. Normally they are issued in order to contribute to a legislative debate or to another policy debate that is happening at the national level, and as a result they have to be timely, right? They cannot be available after 60 days when maybe the debate is over. So that's the only exception. Now, in terms of engaging, as I said, you can engage throughout all these things that they do, all this work that the experts do. You can engage throughout. You can engage when they develop thematic research. Many times they send out calls for submissions. So please, 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 we always encourage you to send information, to participate in events, webinars, workshops, etc. You can country visit, civil society contribution is super important. You can send inputs before the country visit. Normally, I think there was a question of how do we know there is a country visit in your country? You will need to check a bit the Office of the High Commissioner website, and I can provide you the link to see what are the forthcoming country visits, for example, and then normally there is a contact, and then you could send inputs before the country visit. So while the expert is preparing it, also in terms of issues to look at, places to visit, individuals, organizations to meet, etc. Participate in the meetings during the country visit. So normally civil society are always a key partner interlocutors during the country visit. So there are various meetings organized, individual, by collective, you name it, different ways. And then follow up on the recommendation made by the Special Rapporteur, because as I mentioned, there will be an official report. So it's absolutely key that civil society organization, then they are really in the lead for the implementation of their recommendations, because the Special Rapporteur, as I mentioned, they have a global mandate. So sometimes it's difficult for them to do the follow-up at the country level every time they conduct a country visit. So civil society's role in that is absolutely great. And also then to send information back to the rapporteur saying, look, after a year, you issue this recommendation, after a year, nothing is happening. And then maybe the independent expert can also intervene for following it up. And then on the communications procedure that I mentioned to you, of course, you can submit any type of information on alleged human rights violations. And, if that case is taken up, you will get to know. And eventually it's good if your case is taken up that you also follow up by sending information on what's happened after the case, right? So it's very important for us. So this is very briefly, sorry, I've taken up too much of your time. This applies to all the special procedures mechanism. So now, including the one that are very relevant here, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women, which are the only 2 special procedures mechanisms specifically devoted to women's rights, violence against women and discrimination against women. We have a colleague who will give you a few highlights of these two mandates, and then we'll give the floor to Melissa, who is the chair of the working group, and then she can tell you a little bit more, and you can have an exchange with her on global update on the situation of women's rights. Thank you very much. Renata, over to you.
Thank you very much, Federica, and happy to be here with all of you. My name is Renata, and I work at OHCHR supporting the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. And I've joined this meeting briefly to share some information about the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and also about the working group. As Federica mentioned, these are the two mandates that are specifically devoted to women's rights. And I'll start with the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. The current mandate holder is Rima Salem from Jordan. She started her tenure in August last year, so she's just getting started. And actually, we have had quite a number of Special Rapporteurs already in this mandate, because this is one of the oldest mandates of the special procedures. It's almost 30 years old now. It was created in 1994 by the Human Rights Commission before the Human Rights Council was created. And so this mandate has a long history of thematic work, of country visits, since it has been around for such a long time. And I wouldn't be able to present all of the topics and different areas the mandate has worked on, but just to highlight that in speaking broadly, we can say that in the first decade, the mandate has done a lot of work in terms of standard setting. So it explored a lot of new issues. For instance, the former rapporteur did a lot of work on domestic violence, on the relationship between culture and violence against women. She had a model law on domestic violence as well, which was presented at the time. And then other violence in other contexts, violence in the community related to conflict, violence against women deprived of liberty, and so forth. And in the most recent years, the focus has been mostly, but not only, in the implementation of these standards and of these recommendations that have been put forward not only by the mandate, but also by the CEDAW committee, by other entities in the human rights system. And so in summary, we can distribute the main issues that were covered by the mandate in terms of the description of different manifestations of violence against women. So yeah, as I mentioned, there was work on domestic violence, sexual violence in conflict, different kinds of violence. More recently, the mandate worked on, for instance, on online violence against women, obstetric violence. So there's different kinds of gender-based violence. There has also been some thematic work specifically on groups of women that might be more at risk of violence. So, for instance, as I mentioned, women deprived of liberty. There was a report also on intersectionality and different groups that might be vulnerable to violence. And as I will mention, the rapporteur is finalizing a report on violence against Indigenous women and girls that will be presented to the Human Rights Council in June. There was also work on key standards and guidelines for states and other stakeholders. So, for instance, there was a report on protection orders and access to services, including shelters to victims. Also on data collection, there's a report on the Femicide Watch initiative, which I'll also briefly mention, on how states should gather information on violence against women, and particularly on femicide or gender-related killings of women. And finally, there were some reports on the issue of the adequacy of the international framework on violence against women. So this is something that comes and goes. And as was mentioned previously, for some regions, there are specific treaties for the Americas and for Europe, specific treaties on violence against women. And so there is a lot of debate at the UN, at the international level, on the adequacy of the existing framework here. So if I can continue with the next slide. So just to briefly mention, as I've already mentioned a few of these, some of the recent thematic reports that the mandate issued were on the relationship between domestic violence and COVID-19. Obviously, this was a big issue. It continues to be a big issue in the context of the pandemic. There was some work on violence against women journalists, a specific report on the criminalization and prosecution of rape. And so the Repertoire also issued a model law to guide states on the best practices in terms of legislation to not only define rape, but also determine the conditions for it to be prosecuted as a criminal offense. And also on femicide, so mostly following the implementation of the femicide watches, which I'll mention just in a bit. And as I mentioned, the upcoming report to the Human Rights Council will be on violence against Indigenous women and girls. And the Special Rapporteur is also preparing her report to the General Assembly. She reports to both the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, and she will, for the General Assembly, she will address the issue of climate change and the relationship with violence against women. And so switching briefly to country visits, there have been 62 country visits by this mandate. And the most recent ones have been to, I listed a few, the most recent: Argentina, Australia, Bahamas, Canada, Nepal, Bulgaria, Ecuador. And Ecuador was the last one before COVID. It was in 2019. I think there was a question here about the impact that the pandemic has had on country visits, and it is indeed something that greatly disrupted the work that we do, and particularly the country visits which require this in-person presence. But in December last year, we went to Mongolia, and we are slowly getting started again. And for this year, we already have one visit that is confirmed to Brazil, which will take place in late May. And we will be publishing a call for inputs very shortly, and we would welcome any information from organizations that have worked in Brazil on the country. And we are also in discussions with Turkey and Sudan for other visits. Probably Turkey would still be this year. So once we have confirmation of dates, we will also issue a call for inputs for these visits. And the same way, we would welcome any information you can provide, and also your collaboration during the visit. We always seek to meet civil society to receive information during the visit, and it's very crucial to have a good outcome to the visit. And just to give you a brief view of the enormous flow of information that we receive on allegations of human rights violations, and the work that is done with these communications, these letters that I sent to states, since in the past 6 years, since 2016, the mandate has signed 373 communications that have some relation with violence against women. In many cases, these are allegations that involve a number of human rights violations, not only on violence against women, but of course, all of them that the mandate joined have an element of gender-based violence against women. And I also wanted to, I know we are running out of time, but briefly mention two initiatives that the Special Rapporteur had launched. One is the Femicide Watch initiative, which is the work that the previous rapporteur and also the current one have been doing to encourage states to gather information on femicides, but also to build institutional capacity to collect and analyze this data to promote evidence-based policies to prevent femicide. So it is quite a long initiative. She has done a couple of reports on this, and we also have a yearly call for information. So I'd invite you to check the mandate's webpage for more information on this. And also the EDVAW Platform, which is the platform of independent expert mechanisms, which is also what joined us today here with all of these experts. It is now being chaired by GREVIO, but it was launched initially by the former Special Rapporteur, and it is this initiative to promote collaboration and building joint work between all of these regional and UN mechanisms. So if we can go to the next slide, just to mention that the rapporteur has made, she has conducted a series of consultations at the beginning of her tenure to decide on her thematic priorities for her tenure. And these are the priorities. The first two are already going to be addressed in the reports of this year. And she also intends to address, not necessarily as reports, but in some form throughout her tenure, the issue of statelessness and the impact it has on violence. Another topic would be psychological violence against women, and also the psychological harm that results from gender-based violence. Another issue of focus is the relation between sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and violence against women. And finally, the issue of child custody and violence against women. We have been doing quite a lot of work on the use, for example, of parental alienation, theory, and other type of concepts that are based on gender stereotyping that are detrimental to women in legal processes. So I'll stop here for the SRWHR and violence against women and very briefly introduce the working group, since Melissa will be with us. I don't want to take too long, but just to let you know that the working group is a more recent mandate established in 2010 by the Human Rights Council and came to fill this gap when it comes to addressing women's rights, because we had only the mandate on violence against women, and the working group has a broader mandate. It is, as the name says, a group of 5 experts, 5 members, each of them representing a UN region. And the working group has 5 thematic areas of focus: public and political life, economic, social and cultural life, family, sorry, my screen just flickered, family and culture, and health and safety. The working group has recently issued reports on the sexual and reproductive health rights, on the changes in the world of work and women's rights, and also on the situation of women deprived of liberty. It has conducted a number of country visits, 18 so far, and most recently the working group has been to Romania, Greece, Poland, and Honduras, and there is a visit to Kyrgyzstan in early April that is now being prepared. On communications, also a large number of communications. Since 2011, there have been 608 communications, and the working group has mostly covered these thematic areas in their communications. So following those 4 pillars of thematic priorities, the issues of health and safety and sexual and reproductive rights, economics and social life, women human rights defenders, family and cultural life, public and political life, and other discriminatory measures. And finally, just to let you know that the working group reports to the Human Rights Council every year, and this year the report will be on young girls and women activism, and there is also an upcoming report planned on the issue of women and poverty. And I think I'll stop here so that you can hear from Melissa, who has been very kind to join us today.
Thank you very much, Renata, and I hope everyone can hear me clearly. I just want to confirm that my audio is working. Thank you. I'll just jump into my remarks regarding the working group. But first of all, my name is Melissa Ubreti, and I'm currently chair of the working group on discrimination against women and girls. And I'd like to start by thanking NGO CSW and members of civil society on this call for this opportunity to engage with all of you. As noted previously, this is something that we had hoped to do back in 2020, but the pandemic interrupted our plans. Nonetheless, it's really good to be here today and to be in direct dialogue with you. So Federica and Renata have kindly shed light on what the working group is and does, but let me just restate a couple of crucial elements. The Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls is an independent mechanism created by the Human Rights Council to work with states and other entities to end discrimination against women and girls. It's comprised of 5 experts, as again already noted previously, from different regions. So Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the WGDAW states are represented. As noted earlier, we are independent and we do this work pro bono, essentially, but of course with critical support from the Secretariat in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We are indeed one of more than 50 special procedures which exist as thematic mandates, country mandates, as well as working groups, and one of only 2 mechanisms that focus specifically on women's rights and gender equality. And I think this is really important to remember. Although the special procedure system has a duty to gender mainstream and to incorporate gender into all of their work, there are only 2 that are very focused on gender issues. So the conceptual legal framework for our work can really be found in CEDAW and other core international treaties and jurisprudence. This means that we anchor our analysis and our approach in the principles and standards embodied in international law as they apply to the realities of women's lives. In terms of how we work, I think Federica and Renata have talked about some of our working methods, but just to recap very briefly.
Okay. All right, thank you. Wow. All right, I think I see myself on 2 screens now, but this is interesting. All right, so where was I? Yes, so we do produce thematic reports, so 1 each year. We conduct country visits and we send communications, allegation letters or other letters to governments when we receive credible allegations of women's human rights violations. And this is actually a really important function because we get to inquire directly about a situation on the ground and really ask the government if they're doing anything and also to get their side of the story. So in terms of our thematic reports to date, I would like to say a few words because they reflect our priorities and our approach. So the working group's early reports, we've been around for more than 10 years now. I think this is our 12th year. So the early reports examine 4 interrelated areas of women's lives: political and public life, economic and social, family and culture, and health and safety. And these reports are viewed by us also as foundational, and they really reflect the fact that discrimination impacts every area of a woman's life. Our most recent reports have built on these reports, but also expanded into key areas, also reflecting many of our concerns. And they include a report on reasserting gender equality and countering rollbacks, which is especially relevant in the context of concerted efforts by right-wing conservative forces to roll back women's rights and gender equality. And this is a priority for the working group. Women deprived of liberty. We have examined this in a thematic report and we found that there are many ways in which women are deprived of liberty, not only through incarceration, but through many other means. And these really represent profound violations of women's rights due to structural discrimination and gender stereotyping in many different areas. The report that followed that focused on women's human rights in the changing world of work, which has always been a concern, but now in the context of the pandemic, and when we really look at the impact of the pandemic, it's even more, become even more relevant. So a lot of our analysis and recommendations that we made at that time are incredibly relevant even now, if not more so relevant. So our experience demonstrates that the achievement of equality for women in all of these areas is interdependent. And that is really the premise of our work, that human rights are indivisible, interrelated, and interdependent, and that it's not possible to promote women's equal participation in one area, so for example, in political and economic life, without really securing women's rights to equality in all aspects of their lives, including within the family. And of course, also, it's not possible unless women enjoy the right to freedom from gender-based violence, which is one of the most extreme and lethal forms of discrimination, and also to sexual and reproductive autonomy. This is also, this has been a very strong focus of our work. We have found that many of the obstacles to gender equality that women face in all of these areas, especially in the areas of family, culture, and sexual and reproductive rights, have also been areas where there's been considerable resistance, backlash, as well as regression. And this is not a coincidence, but it is really, you know, it's really very targeted, focused, and organized. And so this also remains a significant priority for the working group, tackling the regression and backlash. This is also why we decided to dedicate our most recent report, which was presented in 2021, to women's and girls' sexual and reproductive health rights in crisis. We started out by looking at sexual and reproductive health rights in a variety of situations that may be deemed as crises, ranging from political crisis to environmental and relating to armed conflict. And we ended up with a title that kind of says it all, that women's and girls' sexual and reproductive health rights are in crisis. And this was presented to the Human Rights Council in June last year. And, you know, very happy to share a link to this report, as well as all of our other reports. This report, as well as the others, are available in 5 different languages. And we also have a condensed and very attractive user-friendly version of the report online. Our next report, as also mentioned previously, will focus on girls and youth participation in political and public life through activism, and we're very excited about this report. We've had a series of consultations with youth activists, and we've heard their stories and their perspectives, and we're hoping that our report will really help elevate many of their concerns and challenges, as well as barriers that, again, are anchored in structural discrimination, because, again, that is always the focus of our work. And then our next report will focus on structural discrimination and poverty, which is also a very profoundly important issue, as well as cross-cutting and touches many different aspects of women's lives. So, you know, I think you can tell by now that our thematic reports really reflect the nature and scope, as well as the many complexities of structural discrimination, which is so pervasive and occurs in all areas of their lives at all stages of their life cycle. And of course, some are more acutely affected than others and left particularly vulnerable to the exacerbated impact of multiple forms of discrimination, which is exactly why we take a very intersectional approach in our work. And if you look at our thematic reports, as well as our country reports, you will see that the issues pertaining to specific subgroups have been addressed pretty systematically, and also many of our recommendations reflect that approach. I would like to move on quickly just to say a few more words about some of the other methods of work. We have, as noted previously, conducted 18 country visits, and we expect to do 2 more this year, to Kyrgyzstan and also to Maldives. We have issued more than 600 communications individually as well as jointly. We often work with other mandates on communications because every issue that's brought to us has multiple dimensions. So we like to come together and speak with one voice, join forces when we engage with governments, and this reflects in many of our communications. But I can say that I think many, if not most of our communications have really pertained to reprisals against women human rights defenders, as well as barriers to sexual and reproductive health services. I mean, these issues have come up a lot and have been brought to our attention. We also issue position papers on key topics, and we issue public statements with the objective of drawing the attention of member states, UN actors, and others to key issues, as well as to our recommendations. And these are also often used to amplify the voices of civil society, because at the end of the day, I think it's really NGOs, civil society, who have often done a really in-depth analysis of a lot of issues. They're the closest to the ground, the closest to the women who are, mostly impacted sort of on a regular basis. So those perspectives are really important. And we also do very consciously try to amplify those perspectives in our work. We have also been, we've led and we've been involved in a number of amicus briefs. We also present as amici in court cases, and we've done that in courts spanning from South Korea to Nigeria and the United States on a host of issues. We have on numerous occasions been invited to testify in formal hearings in Parliament, as well as in other policy settings, to support law reform efforts that are being led by local activists and policymakers. Argentina and New York State actually are two examples, recent examples that come to mind. We also regularly issue public statements on urgent matters, and we often speak with one voice with other mandate holders within the UN system. The situation in Afghanistan is a recent example. Ukraine is an even more recent example where we've come together and issued public statements urging greater attention to human rights. And we are often quoted by the press on current issues as well. Oftentimes we will use a combination of strategies, such as, for example, communications as well as briefings for member states. We are often invited by permanent missions, by governments, to brief them on what's happening on the ground, because we are fairly well connected to organizations. And of course, we also bring our own analysis and we make recommendations. So we often brief permanent missions in member states. So essentially, we work all year round. There isn't just a particular week or a month when we do our work. We, with the support of the Secretariat, work 24/7, and we can be reached anytime via the Secretariat. In terms of just some additional things which might be useful for you to know in relation to how we engage with civil society, well, we do formally convene as a group. Because we're a working group, we have to formally convene a few times a year. We do that 3 times a year, twice in Geneva and once in New York. We have in recent years also tried to convene in regions so that we can engage more directly and closely with regional mechanisms and organizations in specific regions. So we were able to do that in Ethiopia a few years ago, and we're hoping to convene in a region this year as well. It's possible that we will convene in Asia, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed, but we can formally convene 3 times. And during our sessions, when we're together for a whole week, we have a dedicated time slot to hear from civil society. So we are briefed by civil society. We're also briefed by UN agencies. And we also have a special session with permanent missions where we then get to engage with them. But civil society definitely has a dedicated spot during that time, 3 times a year. We are often, we receive submissions for thematic reports. We invite submissions, so we rely very heavily on the information that we receive from NGOs, and oftentimes NGOs will also help us host consultations where we also get to hear from other NGOs. So that's a very critical role that NGOs play. NGOs are often a source of information for our communications, our allegation letters in particular, as well as other letters. Also during country visits, we make it a point to engage with civil society organizations to hear their perspectives and learn about what's really happening on the ground. We meet government officials, of course, they will tell us what they're doing, but it's really important for us to hear from NGOs about what's actually happening to women, what the barriers are, and what some of the context-specific solutions are as well. And all of this information informs our reports. We have seen civil society organizations use our reports and our analysis in their advocacy. So whether it's for law reform or in strategic litigation, or even just to promote conversations around key issues. We have seen more and more civil society organizations use our report, so that is actually a very positive development. And we are often invited to participate in briefings by civil society organizations and panels, on panels as well as in consultations, where we get to sort of engage in more direct dialogue and even strategize and talk about common concerns and how we may, in our own respective roles, try to tackle some of these larger challenges. So I will start sort of, I guess, just wrapping up, but I do want to emphasize that, why we are here today. The EDVAW platform, of which we are a member, but even also just as a mechanism, we are very interested in building strong bridges with feminist civil society, working in many different areas, not just on one topic, but on many different issues. And this is particularly important to the working group because, as I noted earlier, discrimination exists in every sphere and aspect of women's lives. And all of these different forms of discrimination are interrelated and really embedded in our structures. And so we really do need to work together to route it out. We cannot do it alone, neither can you, but we have to join forces. We do rely on the wealth of information that you possess and would like to see CSOs more strategically leverage special procedures mechanisms and our work. So in other words, our thematic reports and our country reports, which contain really useful analysis and recommendations that can also strengthen your calls for accountability, as well as legal and policy reform. They can be used to validate your claims of violations because as we all know, violations occur all the time, but they're often not recognized, which is what leads to inaction. So the beauty of the EDVAW platform on ending discrimination and violence against women is that it really connects global and regional women's human rights mechanisms working to both eliminate discrimination and violence. So this platform has now connected us, and we want to make stronger connections with you. Violence is indeed in itself a human rights violation, and the recognition of which did not come about automatically, but through advocacy led by civil society and the hard work of allies within the UN system and also some member states. It is indeed the worst form of discrimination against women, and violence will not be eliminated unless we extinguish its root causes, which is why we need to work together more effectively to tackle pervasive systemic discrimination. As you may have noticed, we do have some work. We do have to do some work in terms of connecting regional entities in Asia. And that is something that the EDVAW platform is also looking to do. If you have specific ideas or recommendations as to how we may connect with regional entities and mechanisms in the Asia region, please do feel free to reach out to us. We do understand, of course, the particularly difficult and challenging context in which most of you are working. And I just want to be a little candid here and say that we can also imagine your level of distrust sometimes in institutions, even including in the UN. But as independent experts, we are also expected to provide recommendations to improve the work of the imperfect and often highly politicized UN system, especially as it relates to women's and girls' human rights. We as mandate holders often find ourselves in challenging situations as well. And there are moments when we can be disillusioned and a bit frustrated, but we continue to work with the idea of making it more efficient through accountability and engagement to make sure that our collective feminist struggle really maintains its rightful place within the UN system. So on that note, I would like to once again thank you for your time, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the interventions that have come in from the various speakers. I would just like to, can you hear me? I would just like to thank you very much for your participation and for giving us this very informative update. So we're coming to the end of our session, and we have had a lovely time discussing with all of you, and we have had huge participation, more than between 80 and 90 participants. So we encourage you, please, to continue to engage with this platform. We have the regional mechanisms, we have the UN mechanisms, and you have heard on the details of how to engage. Information has been provided in the chat group and in the presentations. So we really encourage you to engage in the fights against discrimination and violence against women. And we shall share with you, all of you who have registered, we shall share with you the presentations made and find a way to share a link for this video so you can continue to learn and to share with us. So I would like to bring this meeting to a close and just thank everybody again for participating and welcome you to keep in touch with the presenters. And someone is suggesting that we should share by YouTube. So we'll see. We'll work out a way on how to share the video. Okay. Have a very good morning from New York and a good evening from wherever else you are in the rest of the world. And see you soon. Bye.